Well, I'm once again a few weeks late to something because of my insanely busy schedule, but I'd be remiss if I didn't offer a thought about this because wow, was it stupid. Before we jump right in, I just want to remind you all at the top of the video that if you're new around here, you should subscribe, especially because this month and next month we have some really good stuff planned. I'll be trying some new things out. I'll be back in costume and on-site recording for one of them, like I was for one of the more popular videos I've ever done. So yeah, just want to make that pitch before we get right into it. Sometimes I do a video about something I'm shooting from the hip about, and it's just a little bit of fun. And sometimes I do a video about, something that's kind of important that I want to be thoughtful about. And this is kind of in the middle of all that. Part reaction, part important video. Because I left it a little too late for it to be a true reaction, and because people decide to be tedious about something I wanted to do an important video about, but also never had the time to do. So here's the game plan for this video. I'm going to explain the context, what the BBC is, why people love to get really angry at it, who the main characters are, then we'll dive into the inciting incident and how dishonest quite a lot of people actually were about it. Then I'll dive into the long-term issue at play and how the BBC has basically made a rod for its own back that will be used on it for all time. Also, there are just so many angles we can tackle this from, and before people get into the comments and tell me there's things that I missed, I know, but this video would end up being way too long if I talked about everything, but I promise we'll get the hits. I definitely want to talk about how funny it was to see Labour triangulate live as public reaction came in, but we may not have time for that, and to be fair, we'll definitely get into some of the funnier stuff. Especially the people who really love the BBC, who maybe used to think it was beyond reproach and maybe don't anymore. I'm about to go into some background and context, so if you already know who Gary Lineker is, what the BBC is, why its political coverage is apparently meant to be impartial, and about why I can semi-seriously say the UK has legalised slavery, then you want to skip to this timestamp that is going to appear somewhere. I'm not going to hold it against you. But for now, let's dive into that context. It's probably best to start with that last thing I said. The UK has legalised slavery. Okay, that's a joke. Mostly. But in my defense, it's hard to interpret that tweet from Rishi Sunak in a different way. While it's easy to make fun of, there is something serious underlying all of this, which is that the UK is in approximately its 75th year of arguing about immigration, and the two main political sides of it, at least in party politics, is one side arguing that any and all immigration is part of some international plot to reduce the white population of the UK, and the other side arguing that immigration is bad, but trying not to look racist while doing it. Although the Labour Party, who represent that side of the argument, are really failing more and more to not look racist while they do it. You might be a little confused in all this, not least because two of the most senior politicians involved in this recent eruption of the issue are Rishi Sunak, pictured here with the world's shortest lectern, and Suella I Have a Dream Braverman, who is the Home Secretary of the UK, which, for those of you from outside the UK, you can think of the Home Secretary as the person in charge of the racism department. She does that job pretty well because she's the Home Secretary who is going to outsource Britain's refugee responsibilities to Rwanda, and which the Tories assure us is perfectly fine. It's a perfectly fine, safe country, and that to have concerns about that is itself racist, actually. As opposed to, hardening the UK's already diamond-hard border regime, which is totally anti-racist and definitely completely fine as well. Since this particular row we'll be talking about, the UK has really upscaled some of its batshit insane policy towards migrants, like housing asylum seekers in disused military bases. Some might call these camps. I think that's a reasonable interpretation of what these are, and that will be relevant later. The Home Office is also looking at putting what it calls migrants, which, broad category that can be applied to a lot of people, onto barges and cruise ships. So prison ships, like we're in any early mid-2000s trash sci-fi show. I want you to keep those policies in mind and any connections you may have made in your head, because I promise you it will be relevant to the main meat in all this. Let's talk about the BBC, the country's auntie, the Beeb. The BBC, or British Broadcasting Corporation, if you insist on the full name, is a public service broadcaster. It broadcasts on radio and TV, as well as maintaining a website that provides news and various resources. Its entertainment output ranges from radio channels that play classical music to children's TV shows and Doctor Who, which is probably the BBC product that you are most familiar with, unless of course you know who worked with HBO on Rome. Video potentially coming soon. Don't know why I whispered that bit, but anyway, we'll power on. The BBC has quite a prominent position in the UK. If you ask people to name an institution in the country, the odds are that the BBC will be among the first three people mentioned. A lot of people from a lot of different political backgrounds have varying levels of affection and what I'd call nostalgia for a BBC that no longer really exists. When did it stop existing? That somewhat depends on who you ask. If you're a right-winger, it probably stopped existing in 1978 when the final episode of the black and white minstrel show aired. And no, I will not be showing you a picture of it, because yes, it involves blackface. If you're of a centrist, liberal background and vibe, you probably regard the year 2016 as year zero for everything going wrong, so yeah, probably then. And if you're a left-winger, that question's actually kind of harder to pin down. You could argue for the 2014 and the Scottish independence referendum. You could argue for November 2015, which I will explain the specificity of later. Perhaps the 2015 election, perhaps the 2019 election, or perhaps you just never thought it was an institution worth saving or venerating. The truth is that the BBC, that a lot of people imagine, is just that, imaginary, or cherry-picked examples of what it does well. Which is fine, you can acknowledge that this is the case. So I quite like the BBC sports coverage, which is shockingly related to this video. I don't like its political coverage, and the BBC does embody a certain type of reaction when it's criticised. And I'll set that aside for now. Gary Lineker is someone who probably shouldn't be a significant topic of conversation. I don't mean that in a stick to the football kind of condescension that a lot of people like to engage in. I mean that in a healthy political system, Gary Lineker's opinion would not have such a massive vacuum to fill up. I'll do the obligatory bits about Gary Lineker. Yes, Gary Lineker is most famous for shitting himself on the pitch, and yeah, he was a really good striker and might have been England's top goal scorer at one point. Either way, he's not really your typical opinion haver because he has a big platform and is contracted by the BBC to host Match of the Day, a football highlight show for the Premier League, which, as you might imagine, means Gary Lineker is someone who the public are quite familiar with and might even have a lot of goodwill towards, which, rather funnily, one of the major political parties in the country couldn't figure that out. Anyway, Gary Lineker is not employed by the BBC for political commentary, and he primarily covers sports. Now, impartiality does apply to sport, right? But I think it's a little less serious and contentious for Gary Lineker to maybe be a bit partial towards one of his former clubs than, you know, a BBC political journalist lying about a senior politician's views on a controversial, topical policy. Again, just remember that because we will be circling back to that, I promise. He's also a freelancer, which means he's not like a direct employee of the BBC and that different rules apply to him, which will be important. Well, which is important, but will be important. The other thing for us to note before we really dive into the specific events is that Gary Lineker, like a lot of people, has opinions. And, you know, poor him, he's going to regret that, I guess. But he has opinions on things that are happening, and sometimes he expresses them. Now, his politics are not my politics, and they're probably not your politics if you're a typical viewer of the channel. But I do think he should be allowed to express them, even if I find them annoying, and even if he is a commentator on Match of the Day. well, a pundit on Match of the Day. Commentator's a different job. I know this. I'm supposed to be the, like, sports person here. The thing is, and I think this is important context, which is that the BBC allowed Gary Lineker to be outspoken about something that I've actually done a video on, which was the World Cup in Qatar. So he has actually been allowed to express political opinions, even quite robust ones. So what exactly has happened here? Why am I talking about an ex-footballer in reference to the BBC and its impartiality requirement and crisis, as I call it in the title? Well, it turns out if you host the most popular TV show about the most popular sport in the country and you decide to be controversial, then it becomes news. So what did Gary Lineker say exactly? Before I reveal that to you, I just want to show you some of the reaction to what he said. Labour's Shadow Home Secretary and Liberal sensible favourite Yvette Cooper came out and said she didn't agree with the tweet because the comparison he made is wrong. Which, I'm not convinced by, but we'll see why later on. Suella Braverman's husband even did an interview where the headline suggested that Gary Lineker called Suella Braverman a Nazi. The BBC ended up suspending him from hosting Match of the Day over the tweet. Now, these reactions are quite strange because he must have said something really, really strong. It must have been quite the statement. Now, I want you to bear in mind the government policies that I mentioned in the context. And remember, if you skip the context, you probably know about Britain's policies towards asylum seekers and migrants. So, I want to share the tweet with you, and I'm going to read it out in full. There is no influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s. And I'm out of order. If you were listening to a lot of mainstream reaction, and indeed the reaction of Suella Braverman's husband, you might have thought that Gary Lineker explicitly said that the UK government was imitating the Nazis. The thing is, he never said that. Now, I'm not a child or deliberately being obtuse. I do understand the implication of Germany in the 30s, and I do understand some, but not all, of the reluctance to draw that comparison. This interpretation of Lineker's tweet is what led to his suspension from hosting Match of the Day, which, I'll remind you, is the most popular show about the most popular league of the most popular sport in the UK. It became a big deal, as this video's existence probably explains, and various sports commentators and pundits decide to go on a little wildcat strike in solidarity with Lineker. This led to one of the funniest episodes of Match of the Day you'll ever see, with a bare bones broadcast that was, to be honest, quite a good illustration of the value of punditry. Not that I think Gary Lineker should be getting paid as much as he does, but hey, it was maybe he earned some of it, but definitely not all of it. Match of the Day was only 20 minutes long without the commentary, and it was really fucking shit. Like, really shit. There weren't commentators, there wasn't anything. It was fucking abysmal. But if you happen to be missing some of that commentary, GB News, Britain's attempt to answer what if Fox News had a prion disease, did an alternative Match of the Day. And in the interest of fairness, and to let the market decide, if you will, I'll play a little clip of it for you to see whether you think it's good.
Patrick, do you have an emotional affection for Leeds? Because when I grew up, they were a massive team.
No, I am a Manchester United fan, so I would quite happily see Leeds go down. So, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, Leeds should have probably lost. Brighton I've never been to, although I imagine that Gary Lineker would quite like Brighton because it's full of rainbow flags and woke people.
I think that's a fair point. The tofu-eating wokerati.
That wasn't even the worst clip of it I could find, but yeah, that's pretty much a summary of it. The BBC Director General, that is, the big boss, who suspended Lineker, looked like a massive prick, because to be honest, most of the public found his commentary on the issue of the UK's immigration and asylum policy to be mostly inoffensive, or at the very least that he had the right to express that opinion. It was only really right-wing shitheads who went out of their way to claim that Lineker made an explicit comparison to the Nazis. To which, I'd say if that comparison feels a little close to home, maybe that tells you something. I don't know, but this whole thing did ignite a tedious debate over whether we're allowed to draw comparison with 1930s Germany and the Nazis themselves, to which I'd say, of course we are. It's probably the one bit of history British people actually vaguely understand, though maybe we should learn a little bit more about the UK's own history in the 1930s and 40s and see whether Gary Lineker could have made a more apt comparison. But, you know, both good. Both good, I would say. We talk about never again, and that's good. The horrors of the Holocaust should never be repeated and are an example that most people can point to as unambiguously bad. And if you don't think that they're unambiguously bad, I'm going to need you to fuck off about now. If we mean never again, that means we need to be able to draw these comparisons sometimes. This isn't the main point of the video, but this requirement for being hyper-precise with our language isn't actually helpful to our stated goals. I get that it makes people uncomfortable, especially when we're talking about the UK's modern immigration policy, but remember those policies I mentioned earlier. Do we think that they're that far removed? Let's take an example. In October 2022, an asylum seeker centre, which again is a thing that we might call a camp, had a confirmed outbreak of diphtheria. Diphtheria is a highly contagious disease, and people in asylum seeker centres, in that particular one at least, slept closely together before they'd be taken to deportation flights without necessarily being tested for the disease. These events need to be understood with all this in mind. A BBC Director General, under the guise of impartiality, suspended a freelancer for social media use that was strictly personal. It will be of interest to note that the BBC Director General, Tim Davie, I'm not 100% on that, but definitely was a paid-up member of the Conservative Party. That's the party doing all of the horrible things at the moment to asylum seekers. He was a failed council candidate in 1993 and 1994, and was the deputy chair of a Conservative Party association in Hammersmith and Fulham. In fact, these kinds of connections keep cropping up. Robbie Gibb, who was the Downing Street Director of Communications under Theresa May, which, given how Theresa May communicated, heavily implied he was not good at his job, but neither here nor there, ended up being appointed to the BBC's board, which is its governing body, and suddenly pointing these things out became okay for a certain type of journalist and person around August 2022. Wonder why and what changed, but it became highly relevant when the Gary Lineker stuff went down. Suddenly, it wasn't Trumpian conspiracism to point out the closeness between the BBC and the government, not just in terms of how it's funded via the license fee mechanism, but by the personnel who staff it. It even got to the point that we had probable war criminal turned men's mental health icon Alistair Campbell lambast the BBC over its treatment of everyone's favourite folk devil Jeremy Corbyn. It's worth noting that the BBC's unfair treatment of Corbyn, which we'll probably touch on a bit later on because it is relevant to the impartiality issue, was only made possible in its intensity by people like Campbell and people who were aligned with his politics, airing every single insane, often fictional grievance they had. There was also the spectacle of Gary Lineker being accused of anti-Semitism because of the comparison he drew. Look, if you're not from the UK, you probably don't really get where this has come from, but I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is true. People on a certain, quite deranged part of Twitter were calling him Hamas Crisp Man. I just need you to understand how insane parts of this discourse got. Lineker was accused, at least by implication, of softcore Holocaust denial by blackface enthusiast turned public intellectual David Baddiel. To which I'd simply say, shut the fuck up, David, you fucking dipshit. Sorry, he frustrates me because he's so plainly stupid, yet is treated as if he's an authority on anti-racism when he's an edgy 90s comedian who found a way to play the victim despite his own long history of racism. So good on Gary Lineker, I guess, for sticking to his guns because he was reinstated, but there is, as always, a twist. The BBC is going to look at clarifying its social media guidelines. To be honest, their guidelines are perfectly clear. They just didn't allow them to punish Lineker in the way they desired. So while it's easy to smile and say, mission accomplished, there's probably going to be more of this to come. I think quite a bit about impartiality in the BBC, way more than a normal person should. And I've mentioned earlier that I don't especially like their political content. You might not find that especially surprising because everyone seems to have a problem with the BBC, and a lot of the BBC's most staunch defenders fall back on an argument that reads kind of like a version of this. As much as this is intended to make fun of dipshit centrists, in the case of the BBC, I kind of get why they think like this. The BBC has to give due weight to political views held in the country at large. And the thing about that is, if you hold a particular set of views or values, unless you're really self-aware about the precise amount of popularity those views have, you're going to feel like you're not getting enough coverage, generally speaking. Sometimes that feeling is justified, like Green Party people feeling like they don't get on shows like Question Time enough, or it can be unjustified, like Conservatives believing that they're underrepresented on lunchtime political panel shows because occasionally a person of colour who happens to be left-wing is allowed on there. The Gary Lineker saga was mostly pointless drama, but it did alert some people to the fact that maybe the BBC is a bit partial some of the time. And it is. There's a fashionable statement people like to make where they say it's not that they have a Tory bias, it's an establishment bias or a bias towards the government of the day. And I've been guilty of that too. But that's not quite right. Impartiality, true impartiality, is impossible. And accepting that means you stop being so angry at the BBC all the time for being shit at its supposed job. But it also means you can see where the whole thing is fucked up a bit more clearly. See, the BBC isn't an immovable, permanent object. It's made up of people. And the thing about wanting to be impartial is that people aren't. We pick up habits, we have opinions, we, for various reasons, have people we think are worth listening to and people we think are worth ignoring. And having a piece of paper that says, no, you can't do that, is nice, I guess, but it doesn't really stop that in practice. Even if the BBC wasn't obviously somewhat beholden to the British state, its ability to raise funds via the licence fee is given to it by the government, and the price for it is set by that same government. The thing is that the people it hires at all levels have an impact on the institution in a small way, and when you look at senior journalists there, you can't help but see a certain type of person with a certain background who went to a certain type of school or worked at certain papers, and you can see where the issue of habit comes into this that I mentioned in the Folk Devil video. There's no real starting point for an idea of decay at the BBC, or an abandonment of impartiality or independence from the government. It simply didn't really exist, because it couldn't have existed. Impartiality has become a rod for the BBC's back, basically for any government of the day to use to discipline it. And the thing is, it's well deserved, because while the BBC denies consistently that it produces biased political coverage, it produces biased political coverage. It's pretty simple, to be honest. Let's take an example, a basic example. This is something that you'll see if you watch these lunchtime political panel shows I mentioned. If someone who's left-wing but not a Labour MP, as if there are any left-wing Labour MPs getting on TV regularly, but let's pretend, shows up, they're always described as coming from a left-wing outlet or being left-wing themselves, which is fine. I actually don't have that much of a problem with it. I don't think it should be hidden from people. If they invited me on and said this is a left-wing YouTuber slash Twitch streamer slash long hair haver, I wouldn't necessarily object to that. If they introduced their right-wing think tank guests the same way, they usually don't. And while there's probably a whole video on the BBC's habit of inviting right-wing think tank grifters who don't reveal their funding sources, I'll probably have to leave that specific one there for my own sanity. One of the things I mentioned in that folk level video that I want to bring up again is the idea of mistakes and habit. See, when you come from a particular outlet or political background or anything like that, you are inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to some people and not to others. Look, it's just the way it is, and I'm not condemning anyone as like a horrible piece of shit for that. So during the 2019 election, which I did mention, we saw a lot of mistakes in the coverage of the BBC. And I'm being generous in calling them mistakes because they all seem to favour the same side and damage another side. And that's kind of interesting, right? Because if the mistakes keep happening to the benefit of the same side and to the detriment of the other side, over and over and over again, it implies there's some other problem at play. Now, there is a specific incident I wanted to highlight that predates that. And I kind of hinted at it earlier when I mentioned November 2015. Laura Kuenssberg is a journalist who, how do I put this? A lot of people of my political background and experience do not like her very much, don't think she's very good at her job. And I stand by her not being very good at her job. I don't believe that she is competent to be a senior journalist in the way that she is treated as in the UK. Now, people will look at that and go, this is misogyny, you don't like women. And that was the reaction at the time by a lot of papers. They put a lot of that reaction down to misogyny, because this was during the time when they were trying to find an accusation that would stick, and they were doing the misogyny angle for a bit, and it turned out that didn't stick because it's plainly ridiculous. But anyway, there's a particular incident. I promise I'm getting to it. Jeremy Corbyn was interviewed by Laura Kuenssberg, as he would be, because he was the leader of the Labour Party and she was the BBC's political editor, I believe, at the time. And she had interviewed him about various policies. What happened was that a report happened on Jeremy Corbyn and about his opinion on Shoot to Kill. Now, this was broadcast about 3 days after the Paris attacks in November 2015. And so this was a hot button topic. Would Jeremy Corbyn support a policy of armed officers shooting to kill someone who was endangering the public? Now, his view on that was misrepresented, and her report on it was deemed not accurate by the BBC Trust, which is important because that is the governing body of the BBC, or, was essentially. And what happened was, even after it was found that she was inaccurate about it, they basically said, nah, no problem, she's an outstanding journalist, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Like, the leader of the primary opposition party in a supposedly liberal democracy was lied about in a way that fed into general right-wing misinformation about him, but that's okay, don't worry about it. We looked at it, there's no evidence of bias, it's completely fine. It was compiled in good faith, which in the context of media coverage up to that point, I probably, I don't believe them, basically. And look, the BBC let itself off the hook, which isn't exactly a ringing endorsement of its processes and impartiality. And this is not an isolated incident. It does this over a lot of different issues. And a lot of people who would be natural allies to the idea of the BBC, of an impartial political broadcaster, such that, within the limitations of actually being able to do it, right? They're either indifferent to it because it just doesn't live up to the hype, or they just actively hate it because they've gone out of their way to say fuck you to specific political groups in the country, especially their natural allies. And the Gary Lineker thing was a catalyst for quite a significant shift in public opinion. And a lot of people who perhaps would adopt the line that critiquing the BBC's political coverage is biased, or pointing out the bias in it, was Trumpian populism to be rejected by any fit and stable democratic society, suddenly we're like, wait a minute, what if the BBC was biased and was intervening in favour of the government politically? What if it was doing that? And what if it did it to Gary Lineker? That would be bad. And look, I know I'm like being horrible to those people, and it's not the point of the video, but you can see why and how this is going to be a rod that is going to be used to beat the BBC's own back basically forever, until it can just forget about it. Just forget about being impartial. Just be a state broadcaster. Fuck it. Be a state broadcaster at this point. But the thing is, I and a lot of other people recognize that its position is difficult or impossible. But a lot of people are happy to just see the BBC hang because it slighted them in some way, whether it was real or perceived. It did do that to a lot of people. And so, you reap what you sow, I guess, is what I'm saying to the BBC. That's right, I'm talking directly to the institution of the BBC in this video, which means that I believe every single employee of the BBC will be watching this, apparently. All of that leaves me with, what now? What did we learn from this? What is the point of this? So maybe there are some lessons we can take away. First one, and kind of most importantly, is that the BBC may not necessarily be worth salvaging or fighting for. And that feels kind of shitty to say, even to me, because I like some BBC cultural output. It's true, like, I like going on the website. The website is not bad. It has some useful resources. It's where I check the weather. And to be honest, it is where I go if I want to confirm that a news story that I've seen has actually happened and isn't some bizarre AI generation by someone in my Discord server. Sorry to anyone in my Discord server for being attacked like that, but if you want to make fake news in my Discord server, the link is down below. The other lesson is that Match of the Day probably better with punditry, right? Like, there's a reason we have pundits, and it's so that the show actually, happens, right? So, Match of the Day, keep having pundits. That's my main advice to the BBC regarding its Match of the Day issue. The other thing is that we should probably stop expecting the BBC to be better than it is. Because a lot of what I've described, a lot of the sort of political closeness with the Tories, it kind of began under the Labour Party, but under New Labour. That erosion in that sort of gap between BBC and government really began then. And it was, well, to be fair, that gap was just like, they just smashed into each other under the Tories. But, that's a thing that we are going to have to live with. We need to be skeptical of the BBC, I guess, now. And if it takes Gary Lineker being suspended from hosting the football on the lovely TV show, then maybe that's what we have to do. Maybe that's fine. Maybe it had to happen just to get some people to snap out of it a little bit. And I guess the final lesson I take away from this is that wildcat strikes work. Maybe we should do some more of them. Okay, everyone. This was a video that I recorded extremely late at night, so if I sound a bit quiet or if I sound a bit tired, that's why. But I need to thank my patrons, especially the top tier patrons, which are Droneriff, Mercutio, John N, Kersey Scheider, and SMD. Thank you to them in particular for their support. If you want the videos a day early, if you want some voting power on the topics, if you want access to the VIP section of the Discord, and if you want some Patreon-only updates on what I'm doing, then you need to join at the £1 tier, because you will get at least one of the 2 videos a month early. If you go at any of the higher tiers, you'll get both early, and to be honest, it's just a lot of good fun. I do try and keep you all updated on there, and also, The new financial year, I could use a bit of extra profit. Not to sound like a Ferengi. Okay, look, I'm clearly very tired at this point. I'm talking complete shite. Look, do join the Patreon if you're able to afford it and are so inclined. I would appreciate it. Thank you very much. Take it easy, and I'm going to catch you on the next one, which will be probably the longest video I've ever done, and it is about HBO's Rome. So, see ya.